We have a outstanding speaker who has helped the village immensely in the last couple of years. He helped stop the Eastern Corridor and has found some great relics in our lower 80. He found a village. I think it's about 5 feet underground down there, and he clearly made the ODOT realize that this was too sacred of a spot to put a highway, and we won that fight. And Dr. Tankersley, if you'll come up here, we appreciate everything you've done for us, and I know you're going to give a good speech.
All right. Thanks, Dave.
Oh, that's right. You walk around.
First of all, nothing I could do would be without Dan and his support, and of course the people of the village of Mariemont and the Mariemont Historical Preservation Association. I mean, without that support, none of this would be possible. We've been very fortunate since we started this project. We find, as we were talking a bit before the meeting began, the idea is to think of the lower 80 as an onion, and we want to keep building layers and layers and layers around that onion. So in case it's ever attacked, they have to peel away a lot of layers. So my goal is to find out what is significant about the archaeology of the lower 80. And one of the most important and one of the most mysterious and poorly known time periods is at historic contact. We know a lot about the in-between, from the beginning of prehistory, that's pretty scarce as well, and the end of prehistory, when Europeans showed up. In between, we actually have a lot of data. But at either end of that temporal spectrum, we have very little information. And to have discovered a site that dates to the time Europeans were in the area, that's extremely rare. What I'd like to do this evening is talk to you about what we found this past summer and last June of 2016, and end with a little bit of what we're going to be doing this June in the lower 80. Well, just a bit of a review. Of course, everyone knows about the Madisonville site. Few people realize that next to Cahokia in eastern North America, it is perhaps the most famous and world-renowned archaeological site. At the same time, people come from all over the world to visit the Madisonville site because there are artifacts in museums all around the world from here in Mariemont. But they come and they see a parking lot and they see a sign. They go, where's the site? Where's the archaeology? And so that's kind of interesting. The other thing that's very interesting, of course, what we know about the Madisonville site is thanks to this guy, Dr. Charles Lewis Metz. No single person did more for the archaeology of Mariemont than Dr. Charles Lewis Metz. And again, at that time, the reason it's called the Madisonville site, this was Madisonville. Madisonville at that time extended all the way to the Little Miami River. That's Charles. That photo was taken, if you just go down the road a little bit, and you'll come down about across the street from Kroger's. There's a Shell gas station. That's that spot. So that's Charles, and that's how he got around. That's how he would do his archaeology, going from one site to the other. I always thought, well, they're wearing three-piece suits. Well, in those days, that's the clothes everyone had. There weren't blue jeans and T-shirts and work pants in those days. In his later years, with some of his daughters in the background, and including, of course, someone he had befriended, a dear individual who's buried not very far from here, Phoebe Ferris. So thanks to Phoebe Ferris, without her, we'd have no knowledge. She's the true discoverer of the Madisonville site. But the big mystery was Charles Metz, who you can see here. Is there any way to darken these lights?
Yes.
Charles Metz brought in, these are members of the Madisonville Literary and Scientific Society. This is Frederick Ward Putnam from the Peabody Museum at Harvard University. And Frederick, or Charles Lewis Metz, was a employee of Harvard University. They hired him, and of course, Harvard University did extensive excavations. You can still see, if you go to the parking lot, if you're standing at the parking lot and you're looking at the gazebo, off on the right you'll actually see a depression. You can actually see this trench was later expanded. This is one of Harvard's excavations. You can still see, especially this time of year, you can see the leaves, with the leaves gone, you can see the remnants. You can actually see the outline of the old Harvard excavations. But they unveiled more questions than they had answers. The big problem was what they identified was a cemetery, not a village site. So, and a lot of people say, well, there's post molds of dwellings. Those were dwellings for the dead, what's called carnal houses. Algonquian-speaking people, it's kind of like, think of a funeral home. When someone died, then they were put in a short-term dwelling, and people were assigned to stay and watch over that loved one until it was time for burial. It was very similar to our modern-day funeral home culture. And when you look at Harvard's map, as many of you have, these are bodies. These are bodies. People didn't live on cemeteries. So what you're seeing here, there are a lot of storage pits, but this site has been occupied for the past 13,000 years. Every archaeological time period you can possibly imagine, there's evidence for here at the Madisonville site. Of course, as you well know, is prime real estate. Prime real estate then is prime real estate now. So it's an ideal. What a nice, I mean, I think you all agree, Mariemont's a nice place to live. So it always has been. As long as people have been here in the Little Miami River Valley, it's been a nice place to live. And basically, even the unexcavated square, the swimming pool, just to give you some idea, swimming pool's right here. There's a mound over here, and these are earthworks. There's now a house over here. Not all the mounds are gone. This is what they call Spice Bush Woods. It's that little wooded area right next to the swimming pool. And you can see the bodies here. And so a good part of the Madisonville site remains unexcavated. It is not all gone. Thank you. That's free technology. Wow. So probably the last time I need it, but anyway. No, thanks. Appreciate it. But nevertheless, a lot of it's there, and a lot of people don't understand that. Several times I've taken over 100, way over 100, screaming fourth graders and showed them the burial mound in Spice Bush Woods. It's called the Spice Bush Mound. It's amazing it's still there, but nevertheless. What we do know archaeologically, these are the archaeological sites at the Ohio State Historic Preservation Office. For the past month, I've been at war with them trying to get an updated map. But they hear my name and immediately, oh, you're the, you and ODOT, So, but anyway, so I said, I mean, literally this morning I was saying, do I need to get a senator or congressman to get you to give me that information? So finally they responded after a month. But what's interesting here, with the exception of the new site that we discovered, these are all sites that have been documented by the late Charles Metz. And when you look at the archaeology of this area, people are revisiting archaeological sites he documented. When you look at what the Cincinnati Museum Center has been excavating recent and in the past, they were all sites by Dr. Charles Lewis Metz. And the assumption, both by ODOT and many archaeologists around the world, is that all the archaeology has already been discovered. Everything we need to know is already known. And one of the things that we've shown is that is far from the case. And here we look at the shaded areas are areas on the National Register of Historic Places. I've shown this map before, but just a reminder that these are National Register districts, areas that are completely protected. This is the Han Village District, and notice this used to be a square. Since we've been working in the lower 80, this part of the square was removed. Guess where the village site's located? So, but right in that area. So I've been after them. One of the things I was trying to get the data the past month is getting this area restored. Put back on, it should have never been removed. But it shows you the power of ODOT. But anyway, this is our crew from this past summer in June. We assembled at this really great sign, by the way. So it's really nice to be able to see for people who use the lower 80 actually to kind of conceptualize. Right next to, when you face that sign to the right, just behind the tree limbs, that's where the Little Miami River was at the time this site was occupied. And when you think about that, it's not very wide. And you say, you go look at the river today, it's a big one. Well, when American Indians lived here, that river was small. The reason it's wide now is all the agribusiness. So when Europeans came in and they started farming the area, they accelerated erosion. Instead of a small narrow stream, which it is naturally, boom, there it is wide. You've seen the black water in the Oxbow area. When you're down on the lower 80, that's the Little Miami River Channel. There's an island there, but that's the width, the normal width of the Little Miami River prior to European contact. It was a small stream. Keep in mind, the Ohio River was a small stream, shallow enough you could walk across it. Today it's a lake. It's a series of dams, so we can navigate it for commercial use. So when you think about Native Americans in the lower 80, you really have to use your imagination, because the environment, the physical environment has changed. So we were very fortunate. We had a great crew this past year. And one of the first things we did was, and we still have, if you go down there, you'll see stakes. I used this pink flagging tape to outline a rather unique discovery. And I wasn't quite sure what was going on there. So we decided to very carefully, and we hammered in, you'll see some oak stakes. Most of them survived the winter. And we mapped out, we laid out a grid, and we wanted, very important thing, if you ever have to go to court and you serve as a professional witness, the prosecutors go look at you and say, can you say beyond a reasonable doubt this is the exact spot? How do you know it's not over there? And I've been in that hot seat before. So that's why we do this. So in many, you think at Cincinnati State, they actually give you a degree on how to survey. I make sure all my students know how to survey. Everyone uses a transit and knows how to use it. Here we are excavating, and again, one of the things we found is where this pink flagging tape is, and we'll put it back up this summer, that's the outline of a dwelling. That dwelling's bigger than this building right here. It's pretty, it's a sizable dwelling. That was surprising, because most of the archaeological sites known of this time period are dwellings that are smaller than this room. Maybe about 1/4 the size of this room. Of what's, if you look at what's been written, what's been published on. This is extremely unusual. Unless you're in some place like western upstate New York, the land of the Haudenosaunee, then that's exactly what you would expect. But this is Mariemont. We're in southwestern Ohio. very, very unusual and very unexpected. Our strategy this past summer, as you can see, excavation screens. And again, I'd love to have you all come join me this summer. Bring your family, bring the kids. Everyone's welcome. More the merrier. Anyone who's worked on an archaeological site knows that all the good stuff, I know Sid knows, all the good stuff occurs on the screen. When you're digging, when you're excavating, it's all covered up in dirt. So until you put the sediment that you're excavating in the screen, that's where the artifacts come up. And we're very careful to document where they are. We found both this building is aligned east and west. And what was interesting, we were there during the summer solstice. So, and I just happen to have one of the students, if you're over 60 in the state of Ohio, you can go back to college and it's free. Tuition's free. Any state university. So I had a retired physicist. I had a retired dentist and a retired physicist in my class. And I said, I wonder if the doorway of this building lines up with the summer solstice. So we became a mathematical problem, and it wasn't. What it was lined up, though, was with the rising moon of the summer solstice. Now that made sense. For the Shawnee, Grandmother Moon looks over her people. That was pretty interesting. And the rising sun alignment is the eastern door. That also makes sense. If you're ever invited to a Native American dwelling, always go in the eastern door, never go in the western door. Only dead people go in and out the western door. In fact, when someone passes, we talk about they entered the western door. That's how you talk about someone in Shawnee who's passed. So living people, you walk in, by the way, and when you walk out backwards. So the question is, did that kind of custom continue? And here we found this alignment. So that I thought was pretty significant. We opened up excavations aligned with the eastern door, and that's what you see with the yellow flagging tape. We had 4 excavations this past summer. One at the western gate, one on the north and south end, and one on the western end. And here you can see our excavations. With archaeology, the primary documentation, we have 2 major types of data. One is spatial. The spatial data is 3-dimensional. In other words, north, south, east and west, and up and down. So everything we excavate is documented with that kind of spatial data. So when you look at an archaeological site, you see a lot of people measuring things. And that's why. We want to document exactly where everything is found. The other is time. We want to know how old it is. So time and space are the 2 most important. We're basically forensic scientists. In fact, archaeology is the oldest of all the forensic sciences. It's just our cases are really cold. And here we are on ground. Even as we excavate, again, anytime an artifact's found, you'll notice everyone's carrying notebooks. So I make sure all students they keep a journal, which they don't keep. Those are kept. That becomes part of public record. There are excavation forms for every excavation unit and every level, and that's what you see going on here in these documentations. One of the best excavation techniques is what we call shovel scraping. We use a square shovel, and I always say you should be able to shave the hair off your arm. So if you have hair on your arm. So, but nevertheless, it needs to be sharp. We literally cut. We slice the sediment, not take the shovel and dig down as you would planting a tree. We very carefully, we go down in 10-centimeter levels. And I like to take out levels not much thicker than a few sheets of paper. It also makes it easier to screen as well. That way, in case you uncover something, it isn't disturbed. And then, once we get to the area where artifacts occur, we use a trowel. This is what's called a Marshalltown trowel. You can find it in any hardware store, except again, our trowels are razor sharp. We sharpen them as sharp as a knife edge. So, and then the sediment is transferred into a bucket, 5-gallon bucket. I always kind of scrounge for pickle buckets. They smell a little bit in the beginning, but then transfer the sediment into the screens, which you see here. Notice I have mostly women in my crew. Very different. When I was growing up, of course, I'm the first generation where I had all women mentors. So for my baccalaureate, my master's, my doctorate, and even my postdoc, that's new. In the old days, it was just guys. If you look at the days of Mets, it's all guys. Now, archaeology is dominated by women. It's interesting, the interpretations have now changed. So, one of the things we found, and you may have seen these many times, but this is exciting because this came out of excavated context. That's an absolute, and a young girl who was visiting the site, she's about 11 years old, wanted to help. She excavated and found this. That's a real arrowhead. So imagine, in fact, we found a suite of these, which meant there would have been a bundle of arrows. These are true arrowheads. A lot of what people call our arrowheads are actually knives, darts, spear points, just about anything but an arrowhead. That's a real arrowhead. We don't go very deep. As Dan pointed out, the site is in some places up to 5 feet deep. It goes up to here. The site's about a mile long. And that's a big discovery. Basically, if you look at that old abandoned channel of the Little Miami River, that site's found that whole length. Now that doesn't mean the village was occupied all at once. Usually you stay in the village till it becomes so filthy you can't stay there anymore and you move either upstream or downstream. To the archaeologist, I can't tell one day from another. I can't tell 1 year from another. I can't tell 10 years apart. I can't tell 100 years apart. We don't have that kind of resolution. So the question is, did people move, how much of that site was occupied at the same time? So very often sites move downstream through time. In fact, we know at historic contact, this site, we even have a chief's name. In my French, I barely speak English. I only have 3 vowels in my vocabulary, so don't ask me to, even though I lived in Le Chaux-de-Fonds for a while, when I taught at the University of Neuchâtel. But I barely speak English, so I'm not going to say it in French and embarrass myself any further. But it's called the Barrel. It was actually a Shawnee chief who had tuberculosis, and if you have TB, one of the things and survive it, you get a barrel chest. Your ribs go up like this. And we've actually seen that in figurines recovered from the Little Miami River Valley. So he had a village where the Cincinnati Waterworks is today, where the Little Miami confluences with the Ohio River. But he also had a village upstream. They didn't live in one spot year-round. They had a winter and a summer village, and they moved back and forth between them. So what we're seeing is one of those early villages. So this is, we're talking about late 1500s, early 1600s. And that village was early 1700s. So I would argue we're moving downstream through time. But you get some idea of the depth. The actual layers where the artifacts are coming at this end, I don't make slaves out of my students. This is a stratigraphic unit. It's right about here. So we're talking about this deep. We're digging on the shallow end, mainly because I just have a month to dig with them during the summer. But we do dig these stratigraphic pits to document what the base of the dwelling looked like. And an important discovery, how do you know it's a dwelling? That's called a post mold. That's a post. And I don't think it takes much imagination. You can see the circle of the post. That's where a wooden post was stuck in the ground. And you can see it was even dug up the side, so it was pushed in on the side and then stood up. So, how long does wood in wet ground survive? Any of you who have stuck wood in your yards probably know that. Termites, carpenter ants, carpenter bees, 10 years or so. So that's, in other words, how long is a dwelling occupied? The question is, how long does a wood go last? It's pretty simple, but we know some of those posts were rather substantial. What you're looking at here, these are large posts. I got a pointer, so thank you. So what you're looking at, these are the corners, these are parallel posts, the size of her foot, which is about size 9, and you can see size. So these are posts put in a row. And this is the outside of the wall right here of the dwelling here. And a series of posts. And this is just a 1 meter by 1 meter, 1 yard by 1 yard excavation unit. Here you can see another view. These are great because they fill up after the post rot. You have a hole and they fill them up with garbage. Another interesting thing is that we found wherever we excavated, we found this last year and we found it this year. This is the base of the dwelling. See how dark it is? It burnt down. So, now on the other hand, if any of you have cabins, one thing about a log cabin, eventually it burns. Many county courthouses, those of you who do genealogy, if the county courthouse was wood, how many times do you hear a story, oh, the courthouse burnt and all the records went with it? So wooden structures catch on fire. So I'm not surprised. But was it deliberately burnt? Did it just dry out and inside fires catch it? Did enemies set it on fire? Did someone die? Was there disease and they burned it? Don't know. Hopefully we'll get some more answers. But one of the things that we found was pretty interesting. This is in the doorway of the building. That's river sand. It's on top of a burned layer. There were no fire departments then. How do you put out a burning building? Wet sand. Nothing better than wet sand. And before fire departments, that's what people did who lived along the river. You couldn't carry buckets of water, but you could carry wet river sand. And that's what we see. And you can see how it's oxidized from the heat. So they tossed it, they were running in the doorway, throwing wet sand, but the fire took over. And it's only near the doorway where we found this wet sand. But it was in the eastern doorway, so they were trying to put the fire out, which I thought was pretty interesting. The other question is, what type of plants were they using? The problem in our excavation is our screens are 1/4 inch. And if you think about seeds such as the plant Chenopodium, or you might know it as lamb's quarters, or sumpweed, known as iva, or Portulaca oleracea, purslane. These seeds are about the size of pepper, ground pepper. Imagine putting ground pepper on your eggs, those tiny little black spots. That's how big the seeds are. Good luck trying to pull those out of there. So we used a technique, and students loved it. Nice hot day, you go down to the river, get in the water, take buckets of dirt, and stir them up, add water, and then pour, and then you can see there's a seed right there. These are individual seeds. These are all plant remains. Here you can, that's a large piece of corn. Over here's bean. So we know they were eating corn and beans. Beans are very late in the Little Miami River Valley. We also get animal remains as well. That's the claw of a bobcat. Bobcats have been extirpated from the area for some time. We actually got all of one paw of a bobcat. On rainy days, and you're all welcome to join us, I have a laboratory in Miami Whitewater Forest. I'm the only faculty member. I have my own building that I was able to build. It's dedicated to by the namesake, the owner, John C. Court. John passed away, but he loved archaeology, and he gave me the money to build this building. And here what we're doing is using a series of big barrels of water with a fine screen that we lower in the top. We add water, and I have a hose that shoots water up, so all the heavy sediment drops down, and the fine material comes out. And that's what you see. Here's a cheesecloth bag catching the botanical remains and faunal remains. And then inside the laboratory, you can see the amount of plant remains. We're still inventorying. I mean, since last June, working 5 days a week to identify the plant remains. So we're getting a long list of species. In other words, how did the environment then compare with the environment today? What kind of trees lived then? What kind of trees live now? What kind of understory plants lived then? Same thing in terms of the animal species. And we use microscopes. This is inside my lab with students from the field station. As you can see, it's pouring down the rain in the back, so this is what we do on rainy days. And finally, one of the more significant finds, I'd love to take credit for it, I didn't find it. That statement, opening statement, Mariemont has been occupied for over 13,000 years. Well, how can you say that? Here's direct positive evidence. That's called a Clovis point. That came 20 feet down. While we were excavating, while we were processing the excavated sediments down in next to the river, this was down 20 feet. And one of my students said, "What is this?" And I came over, I said, "Oh my gosh." I mean, I can't tell you how few archaeologists have ever found one. And here is a complete specimen. It has been reworked. This is called a spoke shade. And this end's been reused as a scraper. But there it is. Here's a Clovis point. 13,000. It's 20 feet down. In other words, not only do we have a significant Shawnee site, we have evidence that the archaeology of the area goes at least 20 feet down below the surface. In other words, there are likely many more archaeological sites down there that have yet to have been discovered. Afterwards, one of the things we do is we backfill. This is students love that. I'm being facetious, of course. So all that dirt, you got to put it back and find it. So if you go down there and see the excavation, you'll see piles of logs on top. That's so pot hunters, artifact collectors don't try to get into our excavation units and expand it. Now, to give you just briefly an idea of what we found, this is called a longhouse. That's what was built down there. This is typically what we would call Haudenosaunee, or you would know them as the Iroquois. What in the world is it doing on a Shawnee village? Well, if you read, there's something called the Jesuit Relations. Jesuits were Roman Catholic missionaries who accompanied the voyageurs, the French fur traders, who actually married into the Shawnee. And we have evidence that there were Jesuits on site both at Madisonville and down here. We found part of a Spanish chalice, which I presented this time last year. And what's interesting, though, if you look at those relations, it noted that some of the Shawnee villages had longhouses. So that's actually documented historically. Now, if you remove the bark underneath, here you can see an early stage. Note the parallel, just as we saw in the excavation, multiple parallel posts in order to erect this. And why this type of construction? Well, if you look at this, here you can see a cross section. What you're looking at, here you can see the parallel post. This is where bedding, notice it's kind of like bunk beds is the best way to explain it, except your bedding was on one level and you put your stores on the shelf above that. These are still being made and used in upstate New York. You can also see them in the Door County Peninsula of up in around the Wisconsin, Michigan, throughout the Great Lakes area. And these were partitioned into family. The one we excavated could have easily held upwards of 65 people.
How do they vent the fire?
Please?
How do they vent the fire and the smoke?
This is fairly typical. They put a small opening to let the smoke out. But you actually want smoke throughout the area to keep out the bugs. So, I mean, I don't know how many of you slept down there, but in the summertime you get mosquitoes. Deer flies, of course, ticks aren't anything new, and of course there's always this thing called a chigger. I don't know if you've ever heard chiggers. So, but they're all down there, ask my students. But nevertheless, that's why you'll never see me laying on the ground or sitting on the ground. But students learn the hard way. We find in the entranceway these storage bins, and we found maize. So that's pretty interesting. But having it smoky is actually a good thing. But it also, this type of fires inside, this is what dries it out and could potentially, essentially become a fire hazard. But that's what's in the lower 80. That's what we discovered. And this summer, we're going to put an excavation unit out in front of the dwelling to see what we can find there. We're going to put another excavation at the back of, behind the dwelling, and then we're going to put one across the middle to see what we can find. So it'll tell us more. And I can't leave without having an advertisement. If you haven't, if you'd like to read more about the archaeology of Mariemont, Little Miami River Valley, you can see it through the eyes of Dr. Charles Lewis Metz. If you don't already have a copy, I brought a few, but nevertheless. I'll stop here. Are there any questions I can answer? Yes.
We've been clearing honeysuckle off these areas. Is
Good.
that any way a detriment to these mounds?
Oh, yeah. Honeysuckles. I can't tell you what a nasty invasive.
We have the same thing.
It's made it now. In the past few years, it's past Lexington now. It's headed south. It's soon going to meet kudzu. Kudzu's moving north. Kudzu's already crossed the river into
We have
Indiana.
honeysuckle.
But I was surprised, almost from here to Red River Gorge, there's honeysuckle now.
But it's okay to, what we're doing is cutting it off at ground level and poisoning. We're not disturbing anything.
Yeah, Roundup on when you cut it down. The roots are destroying the archaeology.
Yeah.
The roots are absolutely destructive.
We're looking for volunteers if anyone wants to get a little nature.
Or a Boy Scout or Girl Scout project.
Yeah,
I
we
mean,
use that.
if all the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts would unite, we could eradicate from this area honeysuckle. What a great Eagle Scout project, you know, in terms of, or just Scout projects in general, helping everyone and for future generations. But it's highly destructive. Not only does it destroy the archaeology, honeysuckle is genetically bred. It poisons the soil and kills other adjoining plants.
Oh, that's terrible.
I can't tell you what a horrible, you probably are. If you've cut it, you know what an invasive.
So if anybody wants to volunteer, call the mayor's office and Mayor Dan will
Yeah, I
put
mean,
you in
it's,
contact with the right.
We'll accept you, whatever you want to do.
you're doing something very good for the environment, but you're also helping preserve, from a historic preservation standpoint, you're helping preserve the history of the community.
Well, part of the motivation is to be able to see the topography of the mounds. That's what our goal.
Yeah, because when the Europeans, all those early, I mentioned the Jesuit relations, or even as late as Charles Lyell. Charles Lyell came through here in 1845. Even at that time, he talked about there was nothing, this beautiful woods, these big tall trees, large canopy, but there was nothing underneath it. So you could see through the woods for miles. And of course you can't do that now because of the honeysuckle. And of course, think of all the wildflowers, you know, it's just all the habitat we're losing because of this nasty invasive plant, which was introduced to stabilize the hillsides, because people want to build houses on the hillsides, and when you do that, down they go. If you've ever driven Columbia Parkway, you know the hillside comes down. It's unstable, so someone got the bright idea, we'll grow honeysuckle, and it'll stabilize the hillside. Well, it still comes down, and anyway.
Well, it doesn't deep root, so it doesn't stabilize it.
That's right.
It actually,
Exactly.
it destabilizes it.
Yeah. I mean, if you go to, it's nauseating. If you go to Olms Park and try to hike the trail,
Yeah.
nothing but honeysuckle. And the trees that are there mostly are dead because they can't compete with the honeysuckle. But the real bad news for archaeology is it destroys the archaeological deposits. So historic on back. So, no, yes.
Yeah, do you have a rule of thumb? You were talking about 5 feet and 20 feet. Chronologically, how old is 5 feet?
Well, it depends.
Rule of thumb.
We can't, I wish there was a way, I wish there was, Mother Nature was consistent. No two floods are the same. I mean, I've seen in 10 feet of deposition in one flood at Big Bone Lick State Park, 10 feet from one flood. So as opposed to another flood, which puts a little veneer of sediment. So if every flood was exactly the same, and you had the same amount of floods every year, then we could do that, play that game. So unfortunately, we can't. But here, we do know that we have Clovis, the Clovis cultural period, at 20 feet below the surface in the lower 80. And then we know we have Shawnee deposits in much more recent deposits, anywhere from this deep to 5 feet deep. Now the reason it's 5 feet deep is as you go from the sign marking the village, and that sign's about in the middle of the site, it goes both directions. And part of it's out in the plowed field. We did a survey out in the field and found artifacts. But one of the things, as you go toward Clare Railroad Yards, toward the trestle, the land's going down. And that river, Old Channel, you can follow it, and it confluences the current channel today. So that's getting, as you go there, you're getting more deposition, so it's like that. So down on this end's the trestle, so it's thicker down there, which is good. I mean, we did do coring down there just to make sure the deposit went that far, and it does. The one thing we did with remote sensing geophysical equipment called a gradiometer, dual flux proton magnetometer and cesium magnetometer, which creates magnetic fields and allows us to look beneath the surface without digging. We found that there's a series of these dwellings all the way down. Again, we don't know if they're all at the same time period. I don't want to go excavating all the way down, because then ODOT said, well, you dug it all up. That is their story on the other side of the river. And of course, the museum, the Cincinnati Museum Center just assumes the highway's going to go through, so they might as well dig up as much of Hahn Field as they possibly can. So it's interesting, they wanted to dig there to find something of this age, and they didn't find it. They found a site dating 80 to 1200. Lo and behold, the village site is right here. It's only 500 yards from the Madisonville site. And likely, the people who lived here were buried at where the swimming pool area is now, the Madisonville site. So, yeah. Yes?
Yeah. Talking about Clovis, and I never heard of Clovis. Can you tell me something about
Oh, sure. Clovis is the first king of Scotland. No, first king of France. First king of France. Clovis, a Wampanoag, a Native American from the Northeast, moved to New Mexico. And back in the 1920s, he was looking for artifacts in a sand and gravel pit near a town called Clovis, New Mexico, named after the first king of France. and he found an artifact just like that right next to woolly mammoth bones. And at that time, the 1920s, there was no radiogenic dating. No one knew how old something was. But we knew there weren't mammoths running around, no elephants. So artifacts and mammoths together meant American Indians had been here a long time. He made the mistake of telling a couple guys at the Denver Museum of Natural History who quickly came down and took credit for it. So, but nevertheless, since then, the site, the first place you find a particular style artifact, it's given that name. For example, in this area, there's something called Newtown. So Newtown is a late woodland cultural period. The type site is the town of Newtown. You may have heard of Adena. Adena is named after the Adena family that owned the farm called the Adena Farm. It became the Adena cultural period. Hopewell. Hopewell is named after the Hopewell family, or the farm they lived on, the Hopewell Farm, where the site was excavated, where the first described Hopewell artifacts were found. In Anderson Township, there's something called the Turner site, named after the Turner family. And it was the Turner family farm, why it's named that site. But anyway, that's where the name Clovis came
But
from.
what I really meant was the culture. Do you know anything about the culture of the Clovis?
They're the oldest, unambiguous. Now there's evidence of earlier people, but by the time you get to Clovis, 10,500 years ago, that's the last gasp of the last ice age. There were mammoths running around. There were beavers the size of black bears. There were ground sloths. Instead of the cute little things you can cuddle, these were 14 feet tall. There was a bear that made a grizzly bear look like a puppy. It was called Arctodus simus, the short-faced bear. Lethal, one of the most lethal predators that ever lived in the Western Hemisphere. So a variety of now extinct animals were living at that time period. Something happened in the last ice age, and there's a big debate as to what happened. Those animals disappeared, their food resource disappeared. That kind of artifact was used. I once, in an interview, and it ended up on the Discovery Channel, I argued that's the first weapon of mass destruction. Because for the first time, one person could kill any animal or anything on the planet. That was a first. On one single individual, it was a lethal weapon. There's no animal that couldn't be dispatched with that weapon. Also, those big...
Was the spear point, is that what you were showing?
Yeah, it was spear point. It was the technology. The way it was used is rather unique. In the same way, the Mbudi of the Ituri used it. Now, I know I love elephants. I hate to see this even talked about, but the reality is what they do is you'd have a hollow pole. And these Clovis spear points, they came from anywhere from this size to this size. Huge. They attached it to either a wooden or bone shaft, and then that was socketed into the spear. But it was connected with thongs. And the way, once you stuck it in the socket, like that, and you tightened it, get it tight, now it doesn't move. Now you want to go hunt an elephant or a mammoth. You don't bring screaming kids along. So, it isn't hard to hunt an elephant. They're easy to track. Now an elephant will kill you, and you want to make sure you're downwind. So one way to disguise yourself is cover yourself in elephant poop. Literally. So, and then you come up to the elephant. Here, imagine a mammoth, where our vital organs are protected by our rib cage, as are elephants. Our heart and lungs were protected. So trying to get through that, that's tough. On the other hand, if you smell like elephant poop, it's pretty easy to sneak up to an elephant and stick this thing up in its stomach and then run away as fast as you can. Now an elephant, unlike you and I, our bones are attached. Elephant bones are not attached. They're so massive, the bones just sit. So they're jarring as the elephant moves. The whole body jars. And imagine all of a sudden the jarring, here's spear point stuck in the stomach, and it just, well, it's like a bee sting. It's a thorn in the side, literally. But eventually it detaches, and now he's dragging this harpoon in his belly and dragging his spear behind. And eventually it gets tangled up, and it pulls and pulls and pulls and disembowels itself. So if you're thinking about kilocalories, how much energy you're investing in terms of how many kilocalories you're going to get in return. I once had one of the books I published previously, I actually have one of these spear points on the cover that actually killed an elephant in this manner I'm talking about. The Mbudi of the Ituri still use this technique to this day. So my friend George Frizen from the University of Wyoming used this technique. And he was able to cover 1 acre with elephant steaks this thick. So it's very cost effective, but all of a sudden now they're gone. So now that technology is worthless. This is the hardest thing I get across, even to my colleagues. The people didn't disappear, the technology disappeared. No one drove here by horse and buggy, did you? But we're still the same people that lived here during when Charles Metz was here. Our technology changed. So as the economy changes, as the environment is, so on and so forth, people adapt. And that's what went on with Clovis people. And that's why they're not, they're... The other thing is, very different than the people live here, they hunted wild game and they gathered wild plant foods. You didn't need a village. You didn't need a tribe. You didn't need a chiefdom. Essentially, they were extended families. Mom, pop, kids, grandma, grandpa, aunts, and uncles. The same kind of structure that would be in the dwelling. But they moved along the landscape until they used up, became more timely to go exploit new plants and animals. Then they moved to another area. So they were nomadic, not living in one spot year-round. And we can tell by the stones that they use, we can reconstruct how far a distance they moved. We have examples of stone from North Dakota that shows up in Illinois. We have stones of this time period from extreme eastern Ohio that show up here and on in. I was on a site down along the Kentucky River about a month ago, and there were artifacts from extreme eastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania, and they'd moved that distance. So we get some idea of the distance people are moving. By the time you get to the time period we're excavating here, people are trading. So there are people everywhere. And the neat thing, you can go from Mariemont all the way. I mean, how did Lewis and Clark make it all the way up the Missouri River? Everyone spoke the same language. They were Algonquian-speaking people. So when you look at Delaware, Miami, Shawnee, Ojibwe, all the way up into Browning, Montana, the Blackfeet, the Cree, it's all variations of the same. Now, British English, Canadian English, Australian English, they're all different. Cockney's a little bit hard to understand, but it's all English. It's all the same language. So it's easy to see how these trade networks occurred. So what I'm curious is we found a piece, just a piece of a pot that's identical to the Illinois River Valley. And I knew about this connection before, but actually seen it come out of the ground. And if I hadn't seen it come out of the ground, I'm not sure I would have believed it. But the question is, did someone actually carry a pot from the Illinois River Valley? Or did a young woman from the Illinois River Valley end up here? Women were the potters. And women they taught their daughters how to make pottery. In fact, we excavated a complete little miniature pot, which some of you have seen. That was probably made by the daughter. Her mother had taught her and made the same kind of designs. And that's passed down from mother to daughter, generation after generation. How do we know that? No one does it anymore, but if you look on pottery, there's fingerprints. Now, we each have distinctive fingerprints. That's true. Everyone here has different fingerprints. But mother and daughters have similar fingerprints. And they're different from guy fingerprints. So father to son have similar fingerprints. No one does that because we have DNA now. But it's preserved on the pottery, which is pretty interesting.
There's a plaque
One more question.
then I'll talk to you after someone else.
Has anyone found discoveries in their yards in this area?
Yeah. There's a good reason if you come through Fairfax and you see that sign in terms of the National Historic District, all of Mariemont's significant. Absolutely. Every part of it. So I was shocked. I was wrong about the Serpent Mound, about the earthwork that I didn't find. Charles Metz documented it. It's on the National Register of Historic Districts. People give me credit for it, but Charles Metz found it. But when they built, during the WPA CCC era, when they built the concourse, they uncovered burials beneath that earthwork. I didn't realize there were bodies beneath that. So I thought it was just an effigy. But apparently, like the Great Wall of China, literally putting bodies underneath it. So anyone's backyard. So I can remember as a child watching people put in one of the things I used to do, and people still do it, they dump their old plants over the Miami Bluff, looking in the dirt, finding artifacts. I know, that's a no-no. But you can't believe the artifacts that I've seen in the dirt from the bottom of pots, dirt from people's yards. So, yeah, good question.
Thank you, Dr. Tankersley,
Thank
for
you.
coming tonight.
If you don't have a copy of my book, I happen to have a few.
And Dan, I think you had